Welcome, everybody, to this ODI Bites episode on reparations in international development. My name is Dr. Carmen Leon Himmelstein. I'm a research fellow at the Gender Equality and Social Inclusion Program at ODI. And today I'm very pleased to have Professor Gurminder Bambra. Welcome, Gurminder. She is a professor at the University of Sussex. I hand over to you, Gurminder, so you can introduce yourself to the audience. And thanks again for being with us today.
Hello, thank you so much for the invitation to participate in this conversation. I'm really looking forward to it. I'm a professor of postcolonial and decolonial studies at the University of Sussex, and my recent work has started to engage with the question of reparations in the context of colonialism. So this is a good conversation for us to be having. So I think when we think about reparations, there's a lot that could be addressed, but it would perhaps be helpful if we focused on two broad issues. And for me, the significant issues that I think we need to address within the field of reparations are thinking about the structures of global inequality that have been produced through 500 years of colonialism and how the development process relates to them. And secondly, also to think about climate change as a consequence of overdevelopment, which has differential impacts around the world and an unequal distribution of risks globally. So, to unpack this a little bit, I guess I would say that the developmental process is usually understood as a process of globalization or of the development of global capitalism. And what gets left out of this is the role of colonialism. And yet, it's colonialism that involves the appropriation of lands, of minerals and other resources, and of populations into the process of expanded production of wealth that then also involves processes of dispossession and possession. Now, these processes were initially, they were initially started through practices of trading companies, but these were quickly followed by conquest and settlement. And over time, they've become institutionalized into structures of accumulated wealth, national welfare, and international organizations. And so, in a way, what I'm saying here is that it's colonialism that produces the global structural inequalities that leads to the wealth of some and the poverty of others. And development, to the extent that it doesn't recognize these historical conditions that have produced inequality, I would suggest is an inadequate response to the issues that we're facing. And so, why I would argue for a focus on reparations is that reparations entails the recognition of the various injustices and inequalities that are associated with colonial processes. And it acknowledges that change in the present has to be taken into account in terms of how those legacies continue to structure inequalities. And therefore, it provides a frame whereby we can both address the past and the present through a connected frame of reference. In terms of who's making these arguments in the present, I think there's many critical voices. And over the last decade, I would perhaps highlight Hilary Beckles and Shashi Tharoor, who have been some of the most sort of notable voices making arguments for reparations for Caribbean slavery, for the dispossession and elimination of indigenous populations, and for the issue of colonial drain from the Indian subcontinent. Now, whilst they've been making these arguments over the last decade or so, they follow in the footsteps of a number of scholars and activists who, understanding the relationship between colonialism and modernity, have questioned the naturalization of the poverty and inequality that's been produced by European expansion. So you've got the classic work from the 70s by Walter Rodney, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, or then earlier contributions from the turn of the century by people like Dadabhai Naoroji, Poverty and Un-British Rule in India, or Lala Lajpat Rai, England's Debt to India. And these books demonstrate the ways in which people have understood the connection between the wealth of Europe and poverty elsewhere as historically produced through colonial processes. And so, in that sense, I just want to point to the fact that there is a long history to these arguments. It's just that often these arguments come to be elided in dominant understandings, which otherwise see wealth just building up endogenously within nations.
Thanks, Gurminder. I would start by defining reparations. So, the dictionary definition of reparations means the act of making amends, offering compensation, or atoning for a wrong or injury. And I would like to cite Professor William Darity Jr. because he proposes a portfolio of reparations and suggests that any reparations should accomplish three ends: acknowledgement, restitution, and closure. And we have seen different voices from academics, politicians, and activists that have troubled the concept of aid, redefining it as the need for reparations rather than charity. And a very recent example would be Prime Minister of Barbados, Mia Mottley, who has called for the creation of a development compact through a 10-point roadmap for reparations. And the idea is that with funding from countries such as Britain, France, the Netherlands, and the United States, it aims to redress the systemic poverty and gross inequalities that Barbados and other Caribbean countries live with as a direct result of the transatlantic slave trade and European colonization. And similarly, United Nations Human Rights Chief Michelle Bachelet, she released a report on racial injustice that included support for reparations, although several global north countries, such as the US and the UK, were notably absent when the topic was raised during the UN General Assembly in 2021. And others, like Vanessa Nakate, call for reparations centered on climate justice, with key demands around finance for loss and damage, especially for countries most exposed and least responsible for the climate emergency. For example, some small island developing states and scholars such as Olufemi Taiwo, Keston Perry, and Farhana Sultana argue that the legacies of colonialism, slavery, and historical carbon emissions are deeply connected, and they are calling for reparations for irrevocable damage caused by extreme weather in an era of climate breakdown, for which hyper-industrialized countries are responsible. And last but not least, activists from the global south are calling for a shift from aid towards reparations. And what all these voices have in common is the idea that reparations are not only about money, but about justice. For example, Degan Ali and Crystal Simeoni argue that we should disrupt aid as we know it to build mechanisms for true development and sovereignty of global south countries on their own terms.
One of the things that it involves is the language of possession itself. So when we think about justice, we're often thinking about the rights of property and the merits of effort in turning that property to use. So there's a standard justification of the wealth of nations. And what that does is that it assigns some populations with cultural merit or this idea of having worked to create that wealth, and it casts others outside of that frame. And perhaps more significantly for our conversation, any disruption to the rights of property are frequently held to warrant compensation. So I'll just give two brief examples to sort of set out what I mean before talking about this a little bit more. And the first is the abolition of slavery in the British context. So the abolition of the trade in human beings occurred in 1807, and then slavery itself was abolished across most of the British Empire in 1833. But abolition didn't mean the immediate ending of slavery for those who'd been enslaved. They had to continue to work, and the slave trade itself was replaced by the trade in human beings from India and China in another form of unfree labour, that of indenture. Further, as Catherine Hall and Nick Draper have documented through their Legacies of British Slave Ownership project, the British government paid around £20 million in compensation to the people who had owned other people. Now, this was about 40% of the Treasury's annual income. The government had to take out loans in order to pay this amount, and it thought that it was necessary to pay this compensation because you couldn't take property away from other people without compensating them for it. The fact that those who had been enslaved were not compensated tells you something about how the limits of compensation are understood. To point to the fact that this isn't just something that happens in the British context, I want to give one other example, and that's the abolition of slavery in Haiti. This occurred as a consequence of the revolution by those who had been enslaved in Haiti, and it was followed by the Declaration of Independence there in 1804. This led to the French immediately establishing a blockade against Haiti, and they only lifted the blockade about 20 years later after forcing the new Haitian government or people to pay compensation to them for their loss of property. And what they understood as their loss of property was their land, their estates, and also the people that they had enslaved were considered as property. So the compensation that France required from Haiti was equivalent to a sixth of the total income of France in 1825. And it amounted to about 5 years of income of Haiti. And this was supposed to be paid in 5 annual installments. This was utterly impossible for Haiti. It had to take out loans from French banks in order to pay the French government. And towards the end of the 19th century, Haiti had borrowed over 166 million francs in order to clear its coerced debts. And the majority of that money actually went to paying off commission and fees and interest payments and so on. So the point of these two examples is to state that reparations or compensation is not alien to our way of thinking. The issue is, what have we traditionally understood as being in need of compensation, and what doesn't come within this purview? For example, reparations are frequently recognized for losses to property, recognized within European juridical norms, whether that's property that's been confiscated from Jewish people, or property nationalized under former communist rule, or then the property that is seen to be embodied in enslaved people after abolition. What's not included is compensation for the appropriation of lands under colonialism, nor is there been reparations for the forced appropriation of labor. And so in a sense, it's this disjuncture between, on the one hand, Europe having an understanding of compensation for the loss of property, but failing to recognize the need for compensation for loss of land or labor or self, that's problematic here. And so a reparations approach would require a major inversion of our language of justice to recognize the injustice of dispossession, and then also to recognize that that dispossession continues to have a legacy that requires repair and reparation in the present.
For me, a justice-centered approach in the sector would mean thinking about development not only as an economic concern, but also as a justice concern with ethics and human rights implications. So reparations comes from the verb to repair, and is synonymous with making amends for past wrongs. In international development, this would mean recognizing that development is not about charity, and that development is not always working with everyone's best interests at heart. It means acknowledging that at times development discourse and practice has reproduced colonial power structures which perpetuate gendered and racial injustices, ultimately failing to tackle root causes of poverty and disadvantage. Therefore, reparations are not only about economic or financial compensation for injustices that happened in the past. Reparations also mean meeting demands from the global south for systemic changes that stop the reproduction of structural inequalities. And some of these demands include, for example, the end to unfair trade agreements, justice for migrants and refugees, an end to extractive exploitation of nature, an end to loans tied to conditionalities, and finance for loss and damage. It means basically the end of a system that was designed to drain wealth from the global south and channel it to the global north. Given this structure remains very much in place today, the role of international development will be key to redistributing wealth and power to ensure a fair global system for the world's majority. And finally, reparations are also about symbolic actions that honor the historic facts of slavery and the trade of Black lives and ongoing injustices from colonialism in the past and the present, as you just mentioned, Gurminder. So reparations from a justice-centered approach acknowledges wrongs, grants apologies to restore what is owed, or re-examines how history and development are taught. Of course, apologies and symbolic gestures must be accompanied by material actions.
So I think what you ended with there, Carmen, is absolutely central, because in a sense, what reparations requires us to think about is the ways in which inequalities in the present have been produced through particular sorts of historical processes, what their legacies are in the present, how we need to engage with those legacies through a process of repair, and how that process of repair should be an inclusive process that actually leads to the transformation of where we currently are at the moment. So it acknowledges the past but isn't bound by the past. It brings people together to work together to see how we can create a world that works for all of us. What might be some of the specific ways in which we could do this? I mean, one of the things that I think is really important is a sort of global audit, if you like, and particularly in terms of thinking also about climate change and the way that is affecting what we do and how we think about questions of inequality. There was a recent piece in the Lancet by Jason Hickel, who argues for the need to have a differentiated account of countries' historical responsibility for carbon emissions, which is adjusted according to scale and population. So effectively what he argues is that we need to look at and calculate the carbon emissions that have occurred by countries adjusted to their populations over time, and think about the extent of carbon that has been put into the atmosphere by specific nations. And that will enable us to calculate the extent to which nations have exceeded or overshot their fair share of global emissions. And he does this calculation, and his analysis indicates that formerly colonizing countries, those that he calls the global north, are responsible for over 90% of excess emissions. And there's also a comment that this would probably increase if what we understand as the nation also includes those colonies, because during the period of colonization, places that were colonies couldn't make independent decisions. So their carbon emissions should actually be attributed to the colonizing country for that period. But I mean, it's already over 90% of excess emissions. And that really clearly indicates the scale of imbalance in the responsibility for climate change. And it opens up the question of what an equitable response to it would be in the present. And there I would say that there is no solution to climate change without an adequate reckoning of the historical processes of colonialism with which it's associated. Just as a final couple of points, what this would also involve is the need for a language of justice that recognizes the claims of distant others, and that recognizes that their distance from us is produced by our discourse, and their connection is produced by our exercise of power and dispossession. So this idea that if we're thinking about climate change, the people who are at most effect of climate change are those often very far from those people who produce the processes that create climate change. And so they're close to us to the extent that they're at the effect of our exercise of power. But then when we talk about them, they're very distant. And so we need to rethink the ways in which we make others distant and the ways in which we connect them, and have that rethinking part of the way in which we reformulate our language of justice.
Thanks, Gurminder. To me, reparations remind us about the historical origins of our unequal world order, as you mentioned, particularly that some Western countries have been generating and accumulating wealth at the expense of people in the global South for centuries. resulting on what some called racial capitalism. And this gives global inequalities their racial and ethnic dynamic. So reparations also remind us that countries are not poor due to self-created poverty traps or their own doing, but because of the current global political and economic systems that have also created a global north-centered aid sector, which reproduces the prejudices of its violent past. Importantly, reparations help take responsibility for past and current wrongs, becoming an accountability mechanism to finally address colonial legacies and the persistence of current inequalities. So, to rethink aid from a reparations and justice perspective means those working in the development sector would need to first reflect on our own privilege and power and accept our failure to so far support true development in the global south. And imaginative conversations and analytical exercises about alternative models to aid could deepen understanding of what a reparations and justice perspective may look like and how can they be implemented in a fair way. And for researchers like me, I think we need to repair the damage caused by our blind spots. So we often create knowledge that does not examine the underlying causes of inequalities, failing to recognize already existing knowledge in the global south. For me, reparations can also be done through research. This means producing knowledge that highlights the influence of race, discrimination, and colonialism on development failures, examining how these forces structurally underpin every single issue that we're aiming to solve in the development sector. So reparations also means seriously engaging with literature from the Global South scholars, addressing current power dynamics, creating more equitable partnerships, and amplifying the voices of researchers and organizations from the Global South who are calling for reparations.
Well, thanks so much for this conversation, Carmen. It's been really great to speak with you about reparations today.
Thanks for being with us, Gurminder, and thanks to all of you who heard our ideas on reparations.